Have you ever heard a whisper so small it felt like a secret the city was trying to hide? It came sharp against the concrete, a tiny sound that did not match its surroundings. Under the low archway of the bridge, where the air smelled of oil and wet leaves, the night had an edge of spent traffic and distant sirens. It was exactly the kind of place people walk past and pretend not to notice. "Sir, it hurts." A voice no louder than a tremor, but with a weight that pulled him toward it. Jonathan Reed had a suit that held meetings and promises, a phone that lined up appointments and flights. He turned and saw a little girl, knees cocked to her chest, a frayed stuffed bear clutched to her chin like a talisman. Dirt freckled her knuckles. Her hair smelled faintly of river damp. She looked at him as if counting witnesses. He had rehearsed exit strategies for boardrooms, not for a child under a bridge at midnight. He could have walked on. Instead, he crouched, and for the first time in a long span, he let someone else set the terms. What followed was not a story of one person saving another. It was a slow negotiation of belonging, and it would force him to rebuild the parts of himself that had learned to look away. Will anyone choose to be responsible when the city teaches you how to be indifferent? He reached out his hand, and that single act would ripple into hospital corridors, legal signatures, community kitchens, and rooftop conversations that none of them expected. The wind carried a taste of cold metal. The bridge lights hummed above them like a tired machine. Jonathan lowered himself to the level of a smell of wet wool and stale bread. "Hey," he started, voice careful, as if posing a question to an animal. "Are you okay?" The girl blinked, and the bear made a faint rustle. "My name is Maya," she said, syllables soft and guarded. "It hurts here," she tapped her temple with a small finger. Jonathan glanced and found a thin bruise beginning to bloom. "Where are your parents?" he asked. Her silence was an answer. A man across the path, Samir, who slept in a doorway, shifted and coughed. "She been here a while," he said, voice like gravel. "Saw her this afternoon with the bear." Jonathan asked if anyone else had seen her walk by, and a woman pushing a stroller, Rosa, nodded. "I noticed her earlier. Looked like she was waiting on someone. I thought they might come back." Jonathan looked back at Maya. "Do you want to come somewhere warm?" She nodded, and for a second her eyes were all trust and fear braided together. "Do you have a school?" he tried. Her head dipped. "No." The city breathed around them, a mix of late-night takeout and an undertone of engine oil. He felt the weight of choices he had not prepared for. "We can get you some soup," he said. "We can call someone. You do not have to stay here." She hugged the bear tighter. "Promise?" she asked. Jonathan felt the word as if it were a test. "I promise to try," he said. A bus sighed by. A dog barked near the river. "My phone," he added, pulling it out, not to dial a contact list full of investors, but to make a call that would reroute his night. "Stay with me," he told her, and that instruction, simple and vulnerable, rearranged his evening into a rescue that did not know yet how it would end. They moved away from the wet concrete into a small all-night diner 2 blocks up, lights buzzing and coffee steaming in chipped mugs. The aroma of onion and grease mixed with the tang of lemon cleaner as Jonathan sat across from Maya, the bear placed on the seat like a judge. He ordered soup, a grilled cheese, anything warm. "Here," he nudged a bowl toward her. She blew at the surface, the vapors smelling like broth and salt. "Eat slow," he said. She did, cheeks hollow, hands tiny and clawed around the spoon. "What is your last name?" he tried again, gentle. "I do not know," she answered, eyes dropping to a smear of jam on her wrist. A waitress named Lena appeared with a blanket and a soft smile, fingers smelling of sugar. "You okay, baby?" Lena asked. "I am," Maya said, which meant both yes and no. Jonathan placed his hand over hers. The warmth from the soup met his palm. He called a social services number, voiced professional in a way that felt foreign against the clatter of plates. The person on the line, Maria, asked the routine questions, and Jonathan answered honestly, the list of details replacing boardroom lingo with practical facts. "We will send someone," Maria said. "Can she stay somewhere safe until then?" Jonathan promised he would make sure. The bear smelt faintly of laundry soap, a remnant of some care in a life otherwise adrift. In that booth, they made a small ritual of safety, a cup of paper and plastic, the diner radio playing a scratchy song. "Do you have a teacher?" Jonathan asked. "No," she said again, and the word echoed like a small fact that needed fixing. He found himself explaining things he had never explained aloud, like how to call for help and how names could be anchors. Outside, the bridge dripped, a steady metallic sound. Lena and Samir exchanged looks. "You are doing a good thing," Samir said. Jonathan did not know if he was. He only knew he had not walked away. If this moment stirs something in you, pause and tell us in the comments. Have you ever walked past someone who felt invisible and wished you had done more? Share a short line, write "I saw," or tell us one sentence about what happened. Your answer matters. When people tell small stories, we learn where the cracks are and how to fix them. Now back to this story. Inside a small room at a rented guest house that night, Maya wrapped in the blanket from the diner. Jonathan sat in an armchair that still smelled faintly of lemon. The bear lay on the bed, patched ear giving it a lopsided expression. "Can I tell you about your Java class?" he wanted to joke, then stopped, aware of how absurd work sounded. He instead asked, "Do you like to draw?" Maya nodded and produced from a crumpled backpack a page with a crooked house and a stick family. The drawing smelled of pencil and a faint trace of river water. He listened as she traced the picture with a finger, voice small. "This is the house. We used to live here, and Mama made soup." It was a small window into a past that had edges he could not yet see. He learned her cadence, the way she pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth before saying certain words. He learned to be patient. Night hummed outside with the city routine, distant horns like a lullaby that did not know for whom it sang. He made tea, felt the porcelain warmth through his palms, and asked again the practical question of the night. "Would you like me to call a counselor?" Her head tilted. "Do you have a bed?" she asked. He pointed to the guest house mattress. "You can sleep there. I will be right next door." That was the first moral decision he did not schedule. He had taken board votes, approved layoffs, and signed contracts. He had not planned to sign up for nightly watch and bowl washing. But as he sat under a lamp that flickered like a breathing thing, he found a peculiar devotion forming. He was learning a new kind of responsibility, not for quarterly returns, but for a child's quiet pulse. Jonathan had a past that explained how he became the man who could choose to stop. He grew up in a house where silence was the currency of survival. As a boy, he learns to be useful rather than heard, assembling small radios from broken parts with his father, who taught him to coax music out of silence. The sound of solder and the smell of flux stayed with him into college, where he studied engineering and later business as if each degree could fill the hollow of unspoken things. His mother, Eleanor, had taught him the language of signatures and the trust placed in a handshake. When she died, he memorized procedures the way others memorize prayers, folding grief into forms and burying the rest in work. The first paragraph of his adult life was an inventory of accomplishments. The second paragraph was the cost. He had built a career that rewarded certainty, a life of boardrooms and polished floors where routine was performance and compassion slippery as oil on marble. At 40, he could map an acquisition in his sleep, but he could not name the last time he cooked a meal for anyone not on his payroll. There were moments he had practiced being absent, like rehearsed lines. The realization that a small voice could break his habituated indifference became a test he had not signed up for. In the third paragraph came the choice, quiet and immediate, to be present. He had a calendar full of meetings, but no training for how to make soup for a child who smelled like rain and river. In the fourth paragraph, he found a stubborn appetite to learn, not because it would look good in a press release, but because belonging to someone else felt like an unlearned muscle finally flexing. Maya had a backstory that unfolded softly and then loudly in pieces. She had been 8 when her mother, Elise, who worked double shifts at a diner and mended coats at night, grew too tired to hold both jobs and Elise. Elise was proud, generous with hugs and stale cookies, and had a laugh that smelled of cinnamon. When illness came, it did not announce itself. It scraped over them in the quiet of late winter. Hospital bills accumulated in yellow stacks, and an eviction notice arrived like a punctuation mark harsh enough to change lives. In her small handwriting, Elise had once written a note and folded it into the bear for safekeeping, words that said, "We will try," and then nothing. For months they slept on couches, at friends Rosa and Samir's places, and sometimes on the station bench where a teacher named Daniel had once seen Maya draw robots on ticket stubs. Elise had wanted to fix everything, with promises that she gradually could not keep. When she disappeared for a stretch to seek treatment, Maya learned to wait and to become small. The bear was the last object that smelled distinctly of safety, washed with a soap that suggested someone had tried. Maya's story contained moments of fidelity and fracture, neighbors who had offered soup, and a network that had tried and failed to hold them together under pressure. Her backstory was an accumulation of generosity and systemic friction, of names like Maria from social services who tried interventions, and of nights when the city taught her what invisibility felt like. Their mornings bled into ritual. They learned each other in minor acts, like how Maya ate toast and tapped the crusts into precise shapes, like how Jonathan replied to emails while tracking the rhythm of her breathing. They built a tentative routine where the bear had a designated place on the pillow, and a little robot toy that Jonathan bought from a charity shop became a project they worked on together. "We will fix it," Jonathan promised, and they did, taking the plastic apart and reassembling it with the soft hum of solder and the smell of citrus cleaner. Dialogue filled their days with more than questions and answers. At breakfast, Jonathan asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" She thought and said, "A builder." He laughed and then listened as she explained how builders could make roofs over people who had none. "Do you miss school?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. "Do you want me to speak to a teacher?" "Can you?" she asked. "I will try," he answered. "Will I have to go back to the bridge?" she asked, fear tightening her voice. "No," he said, "I am not leaving." It was both a promise and a test of his new priorities. They went to the library, where pages smelled of glue and sunlight. A volunteer named Daniel taught her to draw perspective lines. A nurse, Hannah, came to check a small cough, and Dr. Patel later offered a simple vaccination with a calm voice. The chorus of names expanded. Lena, the waitress who brought snacks. Samir, who kept watch. Rosa, who sewed a patch on the bear. Community became an accumulation of small interventions, each person adding a stitch to a fabric that had once been threadbare. The search for Maya's family required method and humility. Jonathan phoned a private investigator he knew through corporate channels, Detective Alvarez, explaining the situation in a way that traded buzzwords for real concern. Alvarez, who had a procedural patience and a soft tie, began pulling records, while Officer Lewis of the local precinct logged a welfare check. "We will verify clinics, shelters, school records," Alvarez said, voice flat with process. Jonathan supplied the little stack of items Maya had with her, including a library card with a different name, a nurse's appointment card with a date that had passed, and a receipt from a station kiosk. Maria from Social Services coordinated intake forms and explained in plain terms what a temporary custody request would involve. "You can ask for emergency custody for the child if you are a responsible adult who can provide shelter," she told him. The technical steps were straightforward on paper and messy in life. They needed a formal statement, a temporary guardianship petition, and a medical check documented by Nurse Hannah and Dr. Patel. Alvarez ran a search for Elise, the mother, and found fragments, an address that was now a boarded lot, a phone disconnected, a neighbor who remembered seeing her leave with a suitcase and a promise to return. The investigation read like a puzzle with missing pieces, and every answered question revealed 2 more. A volunteer named Lena combed station cameras with Alvarez, retrieving a shaky clip that showed Maya boarding a bus with a woman who matched Elise 2 weeks prior. It was the kind of evidence that moved the needle from guesswork to a lead. Tension gathered at the hospital like storm water behind a gate. When Elise was found 3 days later under a fluorescent sign at a clinic and wheeled into a hall smelling of antiseptic and lemon disinfectant, the room constricted. Elise looked different, hair thinner, cheeks paling. Maya, brought by Jonathan, gripped the bear as if it were the only solid thing in a shifting landscape. "Mama?" she whispered. The nurse, Hannah, cleared her throat and guided them into a visitation cubicle. The first moment of recognition was slow. Elise blinked and then focused. Maya? The name was a small miracle. They spoke, and their exchanges were halting, layered with accusation and apology, practical needs and love. "I tried," Elise said. "I know," Maya replied. "I was scared." Jonathan watched, the hospital lights above washing faces to a flat truth. Detective Alvarez and Maria hovered nearby, papers in hand, the administrative machinery waiting. Elise was lucid 1 minute and withdrawn the next, a tremor running through her as if the body had collected too much weather. The doctor, Dr. Patel, came in with a calm voice to explain treatment options, the tests to be run, and the possible pathways to recovery. There was a choice to be made between immediate family reunification and a measured plan that required proof of stability. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, the bear like a pocket of home, and the decision weighed like a signature. Moment of tension 1, the reunion, lasted in the air like a held breath. Maya wanted to run into her mother's arms, but the hospital rules required assessments. Alarms from monitors were a percussion that matched the thrum in Jonathan's chest. He found himself negotiating with staff, with Detective Alvarez, and with his own sense of what rescue meant. "We can arrange supervised visits," Maria suggested. Elise nodded, and tears made tracks on her cheeks. "I am sorry," she said more than once. But the system had tests to pass, housing searches to verify, a sobriety follow-up, and a therapist appointment schedule. Jonathan signed forms that felt both bureaucratic and sacred. He accepted that his promise to stay would mean sitting through appointments, signing documents at midnight, and learning a vocabulary of legal responsibility. It was not the hero script he had imagined in his head. It was sticky, procedural, and human. The legal meeting that followed was pragmatic and fraught. An advocate named Grace arrived from a family law clinic, carrying a thick folder and a steady voice. "Emergency temporary custody is a measure to protect the child," she explained. Elise listened, fingers twisting in the hem of her sleeve. Jonathan felt the weight of deputized responsibility as he completed forms that required social security numbers and residence history. A lawyer from the firm he usually retained would have charged a retainer for this work, but here they sat at a community table with a volunteer, Rosa, taking notes, and Detective Alvarez supplying the records. "You will need to show consistent housing for the next 90 days, Grace told him. He nodded. "I will provide that," he said, thinking of a spare room he had never furnished for a child. "There will be home visits and a family plan," Maria added, "and therapy for both of you." Signatures were made with blue ink that felt both ordinary and epic. There were arguments about what constituted appropriate stability, small fights about what to name as references, and a final temporary custody agreement that granted Jonathan guardianship for 30 days pending further assessments. The signature felt like a stamp on a new life. It was a practical resolution clothed in emotion. They moved into a rhythm that was slow and deliberate. Mornings filled with breakfast, the smell of coffee and warm toast, afternoons with library trips and robot repairs, evenings with bath time and story reading. Jonathan installed a little shelf of new notebooks and pencils, the smell of paper and ink a small reassurance. He found himself attending school meetings and volunteering for park cleanups, learning the vocabulary of PTA and child health clinics. The rooftop of his building, once a place for private phone calls and solitude, became a weekend workshop with a group of neighbors and volunteers who taught Maya to solder safely and build small structures from scrap wood. Daniel, the teacher, showed her how to measure and mark, and she learned that blueprints were a kind of promise. The community stepped in with names and skills. Lima brought homemade sandwiches on Saturdays. Samir helped with small carpentry tasks. Rosa coordinated a rotation of rides. Grace visited with parenting resources, and Dr. Patel followed up on medical tests. The city watched them build a tiny orbit of care. For Jonathan, the change was practical and internal. He traded some efficiency for ritual. He learned that being present meant staying true to a promise, even when it cost him sleep and tidy schedules. It also meant inviting others in and conceding that he could not be the only scaffold. There were moments when the pressure bore down. A school adoption officer arrived with forms and questions one afternoon, and a test result that suggested Elise needed more intensive counseling triggered a review. Tension 2 came when a neighbor filed a complaint about noise late at night, and the legality of emergency custody was questioned. Tension 3 built when an old investor called and suggested this situation could become a public relations complication. Each of these moments demanded decisions composed of compassion and paperwork. Jonathan sat through them with a new patience, sometimes failing, sometimes stubborn, sometimes surprised by how nourishment could be as bureaucratic as it was human. He learned to sign documents with empathy, to make arrangements that prioritized stability over optics. His boardroom voice softened into a negotiating tone that centered a child. One night, as Elise made progress in a recovery program and attended scheduled therapy with Maria and Grace, the question of permanent custody drifted to the foreground. Elise wanted to reclaim her daughter and had chosen to participate in a structured recovery plan that included therapy, housing support, and employment assistance coordinated by a program. At the community center that Lena and Rosa supported, the judge would need proof. They prepared a portfolio together: attendance records, counseling notes, a letter from Dr. Patel, and testimonies from community members, including Samir, Daniel, and Detective Alvarez. The case was not about blame, but about capacity to provide consistent care. The hearings involved legal language that smelled of paper and ink, and the voices of professionals who spoke in precise, careful cadences. Jonathan and Elise shared the stand sometimes as co-parents and sometimes as two strangers trying to find a common map. There were arguments and a reconciliation of sorts when Elise showed the judge a receipt for her first month of rent at a new apartment. "I am trying," she told the court. It was small, and it mattered. Integration came slowly and with small triumphs. The spare room became a real bedroom with a lamp that cast a warm circle of light, and the bear sat in a place of honor on the shelf. Jonathan started a small program at his company that encouraged employees to volunteer at the community center, providing mentors, laptops, and a monthly repair clinic for donated toys. The rooftop workshops evolved into a small makerspace where children learned to solder, measure, and prototype. Maya learned to code simple routines into the rebuild robot, the machine blinking with new life, and she took pride that she could make something work. The company PR team noticed, but was asked to highlight community partnership rather than individual heroism. The neighborhood organized a block party where Elise brought soup and Maya ran through a small crowd that cheered, the air thick with grilled onions and laughter. Jonathan's routine had been rebuilt. He still had meetings, but now his calendar included school plays and therapy appointments. He found belonging not only in a corporate ledger, but in a stack of handmade cards and a small, persistent devotion that threaded through his days. 1 month later, Maya had a regular place to sleep and a school enrollment packet being processed, smelling of new crayons and glue. Elise attended weekly therapy and had checked into a community housing program, her handwriting steady in a journal that tracked her progress, the pages smelling faintly of coffee. Volunteer Lena ran a meal rotation, and Daniel had scheduled a tutoring slot twice a week. The makerspace on the rooftop hosted its first open day, with Samir showing children how to sand wood and Dr. Patel giving a short talk about hygiene and recovery. The official paperwork for temporary custody remained active, but the daily proof of safety was visible in toothbrushes lined up on a bathroom shelf and in a robot that blinked a cheerful cadence. They had a small celebration, a cake with candles, where Maya made a wish that sounded like wishing for a roof that did not leak. 3 months in, the community had expanded its hold. Elise had completed the first phase of her recovery plan, maintained regular employment at a social bakery initiated by Rosa. She had a lease and receipts to show the court. Jonathan had trained half his team to assist at the makerspace, and the company had turned an internal initiative into a sustaining partnership with the local center. Detective Alvarez and Maria provided letters attesting to the stability of the arrangements. Maya had joined a robotics club and brought home a prototype that beeped like a tiny heart. The household routine had become predictable in the best way. School drop-off with Daniel, an afternoon at the library, homework with a sandwich from Lena, and story time where Jonathan read aloud about builders who made roofs and communities that mended the broken. The phrase belonging began to feel less theoretical and more like a set of daily practices. 6 months later, the judge's ruling allowed for a co-parenting plan with Elise as primary guardian under court supervision, recognizing her progress and stability. The legal documents were stamped and signed, and the signatures felt like proof of a transformation that had required daily labor. The rooftop workshop had become a non-profit satellite offering free classes. The makerspace sent a small team to teach nearby schools about basic engineering, and Maya became a small ambassador at events, confident and bright. Jonathan stepped back from daily caregiving while remaining of vital support, attending parent meetings and volunteering on weekends. The bear, now cleaned and patched by Rosa, sat prominently in Maya's room, its fabric worn but whole. A community picnic was held, with food that smelled of spices and summertime, and Elise spoke about the people who had made space for her to recover. She thanked Jonathan, not as a savior, but as someone who had stayed. The month, 3 months, 6 months were all evidence of recovery, belonging, and reconstruction. In a quiet close, the story circles back to the bridge where the whisper began. Once spoken, that whisper became a promise no one could ignore. It changed a man who thought his life could be defined by transactions into someone whose smallest gestures mattered. Evidence of change was plain to see. A signed custody agreement, a repaired robot, a steady lease, a rooftop workshop in operation. Jonathan reflected that the most important skills he had acquired were not strategic planning or fiscal acumen, but the patience to keep showing up, the discipline of routine, and the humility to ask for help. If this story touched you, subscribe for more stories that remind us what belonging looks like in practice, and share it with someone who needs to remember that small acts make durable change. Sometimes it takes a whisper to remind a city that nobody is invisible.